Dear students, welcome to massive open online course on research methodology in history. Today we shall be discussing about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana have been part of the popular culture of India for a very long time. They have been presented to the public in many forms, from narrative poems and songs to folk dramas to puppet shows to extremely popular television series. Even in the remotest villages, stories based on these epics have been a medium of popular entertainment as well as transmission of knowledge. These epics can teach us about how things had been in past societies, ethics, and morality, and each narration or performance is flavored with immediate local contexts or references. Thus, each representation of the epics has multiplied the diversity already within the epic traditions. The diversity within the epics indicates that there is no hegemonic epic text, but rather there are many versions of them. Even the old text of the Mahabharata and Ramayana and their present forms have been made after several revisions, alterations, additions, and interpolations at the hand of many redactors. Reading these epics is thus a journey through time, geography, and cultures. Now we shall be discussing about how epics are treated by the historians as a source of history. Epics are not history per se, but they incorporate fragments of narratives pertaining to what was believed to have happened. In epics, historical consciousness lies in an embedded form. According to historian Romila Thapar, in early Indian society, historical consciousness was found in an embedded form in the Vedic corpus, and this embedded tradition became more visible in the epics. Initially, they were oral compositions, and later they were collated and connected through a narrative. Neither the events nor the personalities are necessarily historical, but an assumption of the earlier society is evident in them. There was also gradual evolution of different forms within this epic genre. First, the epos, that is the narrative prior to the epic form. Then the panegyric, that is the eulogy of a person who may not be present. And finally, the epic, with the layered meanings of its narrative. Scholars, when studying these epics as historical sources, have often tried to describe the historicity of the events, exploring different cultural layers or studying them in the context of a specific kind of historical development. However, historian Romila Thapar suggests that the issue is not whether epic represents a reliable history. What is more important is how people in the past viewed what they regarded as their past. This approach is crucial for understanding this historical tradition of earlier times. James L. Fitzgerald has argued that Mahabharata was a Brahminical response to certain specific historical development. The increasing popularity of religious traditions such as Buddhism, Jainism, and extension of royal support to these religions under the Nandas and the Mauryas was perceived by a section of the Brahmanas as threatening to the Brahminical order. The Mahabharata was their response to this perceived crisis. There are historians and archaeologists such as B. Bilal, K. P. Jaiswal, A. S. Altekar, F. E. Parjitar, H. C. Roy Choudhury, and so on. They have conducted extensive research in order to prove that events contained in the Mahabharata had actually happened. These scholars have tried to establish the dates and chronology for these events. According to historian Upinder Singh, archaeological evidence did not always prove or disprove the historicity of epic events or chapters. There is always a qualitative difference between literary and archival evidences. Epics pique our imagination about people and places through event-centered narratives, while archaeology tells us about the general pattern of material culture and cannot be easily corroborated with textual details. First, we will take some examples of archaeological excavation undertaken in places which have been mentioned in the Mahabharata. The places such as Hastinapur, Kurukshetra, Panipat, Tilpat, Bagpat, Mathura, Bairat, and so on. Excavation at these places have given evidence of painted greyware culture, which can be dated back to circa 1000 BCE. Excavation at Hastinapur shows evidence of a flood in the Ganga river. It has been mentioned in the Vayu Puran and in the Matsya Puran that after the flood in the Ganga river, that King Nichakshu shifted his capital from Hastinapur to Kaushambi. However, scholars argue that these two floods may not be the same incident. Another example, excavation at the site of Purana Killa revealed several archaeological levels ranging from the 4th century CE to the 19th century CE. The discovery of a few pieces of PGW, that is painted greyware, as I already mentioned, suggests of an older settlement. However, there is no way of knowing if this settlement had any connection with the Mahabharata legend. Now we'll be looking at some of the examples from archaeological excavation based on the places mentioned in the Ramayana. Excavation at Ayodhya shows that the earliest culture in Ayodhya was the northern black polished ware. Northern black polished ware, or NBPW, here had two distinct phases. The earlier phase is datable to the beginning of the 7th century BCE, and the second phase ended around 3rd century BCE. As for the material culture, the first phase is represented by houses made of wattle and daub and mud. The second phase is represented by baked bricks, town planning, terracotta ring wells, a massive wall, and a deep ditch. It is believed by many scholars that Ayodhya was most probably the birthplace of the first Tirthankar, Rishabdev. Excavation at Sringraur reveals black slipped ware and ochre colored pottery, which is datable respectively to the 8th and the 11th century BCE. The other wares being thick red ware, black and red ware, and burnished grey ware. J. L. Brockington in his work has shown how epics were reflection of past society and societal changes. He has identified 5 distinct chronological and cultural stages in the development of the Ramayana. The epic started taking shape as an oral composition during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, that is the first stage. In the first stage, heroic elements and its geographical horizon were limited. The material culture and social structure were simple and religious ideas and practices were closer to the Vedas than the Puranas. In stage 2, that is 3rd century BCE to 1st century CE, a shift from heroic to aesthetic element, geographical awareness with eastward expansion into the lower Ganga valley, emphasis on the chastity of women and description of cities, trade and caravans suggest that class stratification and subordination can be discerned in this stage. At this stage, the story is imbued with elaborate details on warfare and religious activities. Stage 3, that is from 1st century to 3rd century CE. This stage indicates of urbanization, the king's projection as protector of people and social order, emergence of new deities like Vishnu and Shiva. Stage 4, that is from 4th to 12th century CE. This stage indicates increased importance of the Brahmans, lower position of the Shudras and outcasts, the practice of sati. Deities like Vishnu and Shiva rose up in the supreme position. Trends of temple worship and pilgrimage and so on can be discerned in this stage. These trends strengthened in stage 5, that is the 12th century CE. Brockington suggests that the 5 stages demonstrate the transformation of a heroic epic into a religious epic. Now we shall be discussing about the epic Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is traditionally called an itihasa, the closest Sanskrit equivalent to history. In ancient Indian literary tradition, itihasa meant visualizing the past as if it is happening in the present. Thus, itihasa had a claim of authenticity, but not the kind of factual authenticity around which positivist historiography was formed. Shibesh Chandra Bhattacharya has mentioned that unlike history, itihasa is didactic in nature. The only complete text described in Indian tradition as an itihasa is the Mahabharata. The core of the epic is a family feud over control of territory and resources. The epic narrative partly describes social features and customary customs contemporary to the Vedic period and also showcases the indication of other clans and customs alien as well as subsequent to the Vedas. The narrative is an attempt to represent the history of the clans. It focuses on the descendants of Ila or Ira, the hermaphrodite child of Manu, constituting one of the 2 major lineages of Kshatriya, the ruling clans in the clan societies. The narrative of the feud over succession incorporates the participation of virtually every clan, elements of mythology, discourses on good governance and ethical behavior, and the glorification of Krishna as the incarnation of Vishnu. The narrative borrows occasionally from earlier sources and reformulates what it borrows, both of which hint at the attempt to create a seminal historical tradition. Historian A.L. Basham has observed that the Mahabharata is replete with interpolations. According to Basham, the most important interpolation is the Bhagavad Gita, the long religious poem which has become the most influential text of modern Hinduism. A pretext for its inclusion is provided just before the commencement of the great battle of Kurukshetra. Shorter interpolations are numerous, such as the legend of the faithful wife Savitri, who saved her husband from the clutches of the god of death, the story of Ram, the story of Shakuntala, and so on. These didactic episodes seems to have been incorporated into the text between the Maurya and the Gupta period. Primary obstacle to using Mahabharata as for historical purpose is dating. Christian Lasson argued that an older text named Bharat was composed between 460 and 400 BCE and was mentioned in the Ashwalayan and Grihya Sutra, to which were added the Krishnite elements. R.N. Dandekar suggests that the bardic tradition of the suttas got crystallized around the historical battle of Kurukshetra in an epic named Jaya, which redacted the new and popular practical religion of Krishna. E. W. Hopkins dated the composition of epic between 400 BCE and 400 CE. He argues that the Mahabharata tale was constructed around the Pandavas and it incorporated other legends between 400 BCE and 400 CE. The narrative of Krishna was added between 200 BCE and 200 CE. The Puranic material and didactic matters were added to the text between 200 and 400 CE. F. E. Parjitar considered the Mahabharata as a historical account of Kuru Panchala and Brahman Kshatriya conflict. D. D. Kosambi believed that the text reveals a transition from food gathering to food producing society. According to historian Romila Thapar, given the structure of the epic, the Bharata akhyan or katha was doubtless known by the mid 1st century BCE, and the inclusion of the Bhagavat cult can be dated to the rise of Bhagavatism at the end of 1st millennium BCE. Since the Mahabharata in its present form was created over the centuries, there must have been phases in its authorship as well. These phases are, as Romila Thapar has demonstrated, the oral composition of the suttas, which were rendered into literary form by Vyasa. This was followed by the introduction of new political, social and religious ideas, perhaps by Bhrigu Brahmans. She suggests that this pattern of authorship implies that the original composition was probably in Prakrit and then it was rendered into Sanskrit. There is no agreement on the length of the text. The earliest version may have been the Jaya of 8,800 verses. Then the Bharat, attributed to Vyas, consisting of 24,000 verses. This was later inflated to 1 lakh verses and came to be called the Mahabharata. The theory of three different versions of Jaya, Bharat and Mahabharata composed variously has been questioned. While some sources refer to the two texts, the Bharat and the Mahabharata, the epic itself makes no such distinction. It states that the prefix Mahat is applied to the Bharat. Now we shall be discussing about the epic Ramayana. Unlike the Mahabharata, the Ramayana is often referred to as Kavya or adikavya and akhyan or even Purana. However, In the earlier section, it is referred to as itihas. According to Romila Thapar, this migration from the itihas tradition to Kavya, akhyan and Purana indicates that there was a transformation in the literary tradition of Ramayana from representing the past as it was to a new form of text immersed in creative imagination, to the interweaving of creative and mythological elements, thus resulting in its conversion into a sacred text. The Ramayana existed in two main recensions, the northern and southern. According to historian Upinder Singh, the northern recension can further be divided into northeastern, northwestern and western recensions. The language of northern recensions is more elaborate and polished than that of the southern one. Although the Valmiki Ramayana has become the hegemonic text, there are many versions of the Ram stories, such as the Buddhist version called Dasharath Jatak and the Jain version called Paumacharyam of Vimalasuri and so on. The variants do not build on a single uniform story. While the Dasharath Jatak, one part of the Ramayana story is narrated, the Jain version questions the veracity of the existing versions. The Jatakas, composed in Pali, can be dated to the 2nd century BCE. The different phases of the Ramayana, composed in Sanskrit, can be dated to circa 400 BCE to 400 CE. And the Paumacharyam, composed in Prakrit, can be dated to the 4th century CE. The first version indicates a clan-based society. The second version indicates conflict between a kingdom and chiefship. And the third phase and the third version indicates universality of kingdoms. Now, comparing these versions also make it possible to see the core element of the epic episodes and the way in which many of these episodes or incidents were introduced into what became the hegemonic text. The reason for these different versions, as Romila Thapar has argued, lies in the perception of the context and the time in which these narratives were composed. For example, the 19th century interpretation of the Ramayana saw it as a narrative of confrontation between the Aryans and the Dravidians. This perception was central to the 19th century conception of civilization and was a transplant from European ideological obsession with the Aryan. There have been claims of historicity of epic events and persons by nationalist scholars. These attempts to authenticate the content of the epic by searching for archaeological counterparts went hand in hand with the making of the nation state. Now we shall discuss very briefly about the Dasharath Jatak, the Buddhist version of Ramayana. The Jatak story, which comes closest to the main frame of the Ramayana but nevertheless differs in significant ways, is the Dasharath Jatak. Dasharath Jatak Dasharath rules from Varanasi and not from Ayodhya. He has two sons, Ram Pandit and Lakhan, and a daughter, Sita Devi. After the death of their mother, the queen consort, another wife of Dasharath rose to the status of queen consort, who demanded that her son Bharat be made his heir apparent. The king feared that the new consort might harm his other sons and daughter, so he advised them to flee from the kingdom to neighboring kingdom and could claim their right to the throne after the demise of Dasharath. Dasharath dies after 9 years. Bharat refuses to become the king, goes in search for Ram and tries to persuade him to return. Lakhan and Sita, on hearing their father's death, faint. But Ram preaches to them the impermanence of life. This is the core teaching of this Jatak, where Ram Pandit was the Buddha in previous incarnation. The social ethics in the Buddhist ethos is implicitly emphasized in the qualities of Ram. Thus, he was the ideal hero. Here, Dan becomes a major criteria of morality, often associated with karuna or compassion. Central to this ethos is the ideal of Bodhisattva, who held off from attaining his own nirvana only to help others to attain theirs. Any identification of Ram with a deity is noticeably absent. Now we'll be looking at the Valmiki Ramayana. According to Romila Thapar, the Ramayana, as we read it today, went through various forms. Fragmentary narratives from the oral tradition were probably selected and recomposed and compiled as an epic poem by Valmiki. This poem then absorbed interpolations, defining the kingship and introducing the worship of Vishnu, presented as Ramavatar as part of the newly emerging Bhagavat religion. Both were developments of the late 1st millennium BCE and the early centuries CE. Now we shall be looking at the Jain version of the Ramayana. The Jain version of the Ramayana is known as Paumacharyam. The Valmiki, it is very interesting that the Valmiki version differs significantly from the Jain version of the Ram story. The Paumacharyam suggests that the rewriting of this story was considerable importance to the Jain tradition. Vimalasuri informs us that he is narrating the traditional story of Ram as told by Mahavir to Indrabhuti, who narrated it to his disciples. The initial narrator is either a deity or a person of status, and this underlines the importance of the text. The story is called Raghava Charita, based on the Namavalis and the Charitas of Narayanas and Valadevas, available in the Jain Agamas. It is sometimes referred to as Puranam Akhyanam. The genre remains the same as in the Brahmanical tradition, but the narratives and their intentions differ. Vimalasuri's purpose in writing this version of the story is, he says, to give the true facts of what happened instead of lies and silly stories, contrary to reason and belief, with which the existing narrative is replete. He does not specifically mention Valmiki Ramayana, but perhaps it is implied. The initial scene is that of Magadh, a prosperous kingdom located in the Jambudvipa, which is with its capital at Rajagriha and ruled by the king Srenika or Bimbisar. Srenika doubts the authenticity of the story as told in the existing versions and asks for the correct version from a disciple of Mahavir. This is a claim to historicity. Bimbisar was a near contemporary of Mahavir. Many of Srenika's doubts center around the characterization of the Rakshas and of Ravan in particular. But he also questions the various other statesmen. What is interesting here is the notion of historicity is open and central, not embedded. The other interesting thing is the attempt to present a sympathetic narrative of the other, the Rakshas of Valmiki. Thus, Paumacharyam has been a conscious attempt at rewriting the existing version of the story and depicting the Rakshas as they were before being demonized. It claims historical authenticity for its version of the story. With this, we come to the conclusion of our discussion. What we have discussed so far is the epics began in oral forms. The oral narratives were gathered and pieced together into textual form. There are many textual versions. These various textual forms have different stories, although the core characters remain the same. To name a few of many of the Ramayans are Dandi Ramayan in Oriya, Ranganatha Ramayan in Telugu, Krittivas Ramayan in Bengali, Ramkain in Bali, Mapilla Ramayan of the Muslim community in Malabar, and so on. Similarly, the Mahabharata has been translated into several Indian languages, and more importantly, many oral compositions are available in tribal languages. All these literary oral versions suggest that these epics are a living tradition and indicates the pluralistic character of the epic tradition.